Welcome to Avoidant Decoded, where we don't just talk about love, we uncover the hidden patterns behind it. If you've ever felt confused by someone who comes close and then pulls away, you're in the right place. Consider this your space to understand what's really happening beneath the surface. And if you're ready to go deeper into these truths, make sure you're part of this growing membership, because what you're about to hear might change the way you see love forever. What if the person you keep trying to hold on to was never truly holding you in the first place? What if the distance you feel isn't something you caused, but something they've been running from long before you ever arrived? You keep trying harder, loving deeper, becoming softer, yet somehow they keep slipping away. And the most painful part is this: you think if you just become enough, they'll finally stay. But what if the truth changes everything you believe about love, attachment, and yourself? They don't usually text first. They don't say, "I love you," in the way you hope they would, at least not when you're waiting to hear it. Sometimes they vanish for a few days and then suddenly come back like nothing ever changed. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just normal again. And that silence starts to mess with your head. You begin trying to make sense of it. Maybe they're just distant. Maybe they're naturally cold. But that's not the full truth. What you actually walked into wasn't someone without feelings. It was someone who made you believe that if you just became easier to love, more calm, more understanding, less demanding, then maybe they would finally stay consistent. But the painful realization comes later. They weren't fully leaving every time. They were never fully showing up to begin with. And once you really see that, everything starts to shift in how you understand the experience. Here's something most people don't talk about. They're not running away from you personally. They're running from what closeness feels like inside them. For them, emotional intimacy doesn't feel comforting at first. It feels like losing control, losing their sense of self. And when you truly understand that, something changes in you. You stop chasing, you stop over-explaining, you stop shrinking yourself just to keep their attention. And without trying to play any game, you become someone they can't easily dismiss, not because you're strategizing, but because you're no longer acting from desperation. Seeing this clearly isn't manipulation. It's not about winning someone over. It's simply understanding the psychology deeply enough that you stop blaming yourself for their distance. When you no longer see their withdrawal as your failure, you stop reacting in ways that feed your own anxiety. Instead of feeling like pressure to them, you begin to feel steady, grounded, safe in a way that's unfamiliar but not threatening. Think about this for a moment. It can change how you see every relationship you've ever had. If you've ever loved someone who pulled away the moment things started to feel real, you know how confusing that feels. That constant question in your mind, was it me? Have you ever felt like you were too much, too emotional, too available, too invested? And the harder you try to fix that, the further they seem to drift away. It's like walking towards someone down a hallway that keeps stretching the closer you get. You share a moment that feels genuine, laughter, eye contact, connection. Something that feels real, and then suddenly it's gone. They're still physically there, but emotionally, they've shut down, and your mind starts racing. What did I do wrong? Was I too intense? Not enough? That cycle of questioning yourself isn't you being dramatic, it's your nervous system trying to make sense of inconsistency. This is what often happens when one person has an avoidant attachment pattern. But before labeling anyone as the problem, it's important to understand what's happening underneath. Avoidant behavior isn't just about being distant or uncaring. It's rooted in something much deeper. It's a learned survival response. At some point early in their life, closeness didn't feel safe. Their emotional needs weren't met in a consistent way. Maybe they were dismissed, ignored, or made to feel like their needs were too much. So their mind adapted. Without even realizing it, they formed a belief. Depending on others leads to disappointment or pain. So they decided, silently, that they wouldn't need anyone in that way anymore. They became independent, emotionally controlled, self-reliant, and for a long time, that worked. The child who didn't need much was seen as easy. The teenager who didn't ask for reassurance looked strong. The adult who didn't express needs seemed low maintenance. That identity gets reinforced over time, but then love enters their life, and love challenges everything they built. Because real closeness naturally involves emotional reliance, not unhealthy dependence, but a level of openness where saying, "I need you," becomes part of the connection. And for someone with avoidant conditioning, that moment feels threatening. Their nervous system doesn't recognize intimacy as safety. It registers it as pressure, as risk, as exposure that once led to discomfort or pain. So when things start to feel real, their body reacts, not just mentally, but physically, like something is wrong, and their response becomes predictable. They pull back. They create space. They disconnect, not because they don't care, but because they do, and it overwhelms them. This is where the dynamic becomes painful for both people. When they withdraw, the other person, often someone with an anxious attachment style, feels it immediately. That distance feels like rejection. So naturally, you try to close the gap. You reach out more. You explain yourself. You adjust. You give more. But instead of calming things down, it often does the opposite. It intensifies their internal alarm. Now closeness doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels overwhelming. So they pull away even more. And the cycle repeats. One person moves closer, the other steps back. Both reacting from deeply wired emotional patterns, not conscious choice. This is the anxious avoidant cycle. And without awareness, it drains both people. But there's another layer people rarely talk about, what the avoidant actually wants underneath all of this. Despite the distance, the silence, the withdrawal, they do want connection, just not the kind that feels overwhelming or consuming. They don't want emotional intensity that feels like constant pressure or expectation. What they truly respond to is something more grounded. They want love that doesn't feel like it will take away their independence. They want someone who doesn't fall apart when space is needed, someone who doesn't interpret every pause as abandonment. They are drawn to people who have their own center, their own life, their own identity, someone who chooses them but doesn't cling to them. That's the kind of connection that feels safe to them, even if they don't say it out loud. Not because they don't value love, but because their past has linked love with pressure or emotional overload. So when they meet someone who feels stable, secure, and grounded, something inside them softens, even if only for a moment, because it challenges what they've always expected, that closeness equals losing themselves. But here's the truth. This isn't a simple formula where you just do it right and everything changes. Relationships don't work like that. And if you find yourself in this dynamic, it's not just about their patterns, it's also about yours. Because many people caught in this cycle are also repeating something familiar within themselves. There's often a deeper pull toward emotional unavailability. And that's something worth being honest about. There's something almost addictive about the highs and lows, the moments of connection that feel rare and earned. It's not just about being loved, it's about feeling like you had to work for it. And that pattern usually has roots. Maybe love in your past wasn't consistent. Maybe it came with conditions. Maybe it showed up only when you behaved a certain way, stayed quiet, or met expectations. And without realizing it, that becomes your emotional blueprint. You start chasing a version of love that feels familiar, even if it hurts. Recognizing this isn't about blaming yourself. It's about seeing clearly. Because awareness is what gives you the power to step out of the cycle instead of repeating it. You learned early on that love wasn't something freely given. It was something you had to earn over and over again. So later, when you meet someone who feels warm one moment and distant the next, something inside you recognizes that rhythm, not because it's healthy, but because it feels familiar. And familiarity has a powerful pull. Your nervous system doesn't always choose what's good for you. It chooses what it knows, even if what it knows comes with confusion or pain. That's where the real work begins. Understanding avoidance isn't only about figuring them out. It also requires turning inward and asking yourself honest questions. Why does this dynamic pull you in so strongly? What emotional need is being activated? What story are you repeating without even realizing it? Because in this kind of connection, there are always two patterns playing out at the same time, not just one. Now, if you step into their perspective for a moment, things start to make more sense. What they want isn't distance for the sake of it. They're not looking for emptiness or disconnection. What they want is ease, a relationship that doesn't feel heavy or overwhelming. They want to come home without immediately feeling pulled into someone else's emotional world. They want room to think, to rest, to exist, without every bit of space turning into tension or conflict. They want to care deeply, but without that care turning into pressure or obligation. And this is where the cycle keeps repeating itself. The more you chase, the more their system confirms what it already fears, that love brings expectations, demands, and emotional weight. But when you step back, not as a tactic, not to trigger a reaction, but because you genuinely return to your own life, everything begins to shift. The energy changes. They are no longer being pulled or pursued. No longer feeling like they have to constantly respond. And in that space, something different can happen. Your absence doesn't feel like abandonment. It feels like distance without pressure. And that can create curiosity, sometimes reflection, sometimes even a desire to reconnect. Not because you forced it, but because you removed the emotional intensity that was overwhelming them. But this is where many people get it wrong. This is not about pretending you don't care. It's not about acting detached while you're hurting inside. It's not about disappearing to make them react. That's not strength. That's abandoning yourself. Real change comes from being genuinely grounded, building a life that already feels full. developing a sense of self that doesn't depend on constant reassurance, becoming someone whose emotional stability isn't tied to another person's presence. When you are truly anchored like that, your reactions change naturally. You don't over-explain. You don't send multiple messages trying to fix uncertainty. You don't spiral the moment they pull away. Not because you're ignoring your needs, but because your sense of security comes from within. Avoidant individuals are extremely sensitive to what feels inauthentic. They can often sense when someone is pretending to be okay or using distance as a strategy. What they respond to isn't performance, it's realness. They feel more at ease with someone who is comfortable alone, someone who values the connection but doesn't rely on it for emotional survival, someone who isn't constantly chasing reassurance. That kind of presence changes how they experience closeness. It doesn't trigger the same internal alarm. Instead, it introduces something unfamiliar, connection that doesn't feel like pressure, and sometimes that becomes the first time they experience love without feeling like they're losing themselves. There's also something important about timing in these situations. When they pull away, they often enter a phase where they need space to regulate themselves. If you respond with repeated messages or emotional intensity, it usually increases their need to stay distant. But when you stay steady and focused on your own life, something else begins to happen. The pressure they were trying to escape fades away, and without that pressure, their curiosity can return naturally. They may start to wonder about you. Not because you chased them, but because you didn't fill every moment with urgency. But this only works when it's real, not calculated, not something you're doing to get a reaction. Emotional patterns don't respond to manipulation. They respond to consistency and authenticity. It's also important to notice what tends to make the cycle worse. Constantly asking for reassurance can feel overwhelming to someone who already links closeness with pressure. Turning the relationship into a constant discussion can make it feel heavy. When you escalate during their withdrawal, it often pushes them further away. Long emotional messages, even if they are valid, can become too much for them to process in those moments. And when every conflict is centered on emotional intensity without space or pacing, it starts to feel like pressure instead of connection. But none of that means your feelings are wrong. Your emotions are valid. The difference is not in what you feel, but in how and when it's expressed. On the other hand, there are ways of showing up that create more balance. Giving space before it becomes forced reduces tension. Showing curiosity instead of demanding answers allows trust to grow slowly. Being consistent in your emotional responses softens the push and pull. Having your own life, your own support system, creates stability. And responding to distance with calmness instead of punishment keeps things from escalating. At the core of all this, both people are usually acting from protection, not intention. And when you really understand that, it stops feeling like a battle. It becomes two people trying to feel safe in completely different ways. Let them experience that coming back to you doesn't come with pressure or cost. But before any of this truly clicks, there's something difficult you have to accept. You have to release the version of the relationship you were hoping for, the version where they show up exactly how you want, where they reach out first without hesitation, where closeness feels easy and natural, where you don't have to constantly analyze their behavior just to feel secure. That version with this person may never fully exist. And holding on to that idea keeps you stuck, waiting, hoping, adjusting yourself over and over again, slowly losing parts of who you are in the process, because somewhere along the way, a belief starts to form that if you just understand them enough, if you just act the right way, things will finally become what you hoped for. A lot of people carry this quiet belief. If I can just be calm enough, patient enough, secure enough, then eventually they'll give me the love I'm trying so hard to reach. But that belief can keep you stuck in something that's already hurting you. There's an important difference you need to recognize. Learning how to understand an avoidant partner, responding with emotional awareness, and still holding on to your self-respect can create a healthier dynamic. Sometimes it even leads to a real, meaningful connection. That does happen, but there's a line, and it matters. When you start shrinking yourself to fit their comfort zone, becoming less expressive, less emotional, less open, less alive, just to keep them from pulling away, that isn't growth. That's self-abandonment disguised as patience. No relationship is worth losing yourself like that. You don't have to earn the right to feel. You don't need to measure your emotions to make them acceptable. Love isn't supposed to feel like a daily puzzle you're solving just to keep someone from leaving. If you constantly have to minimize who you are, then what you're building isn't security, it's survival. At the same time, it's only fair to acknowledge something important. If someone with avoidant tendencies is aware of their patterns, actively working on them, maybe even in therapy, and genuinely trying to show up differently, even if imperfectly, then understanding them can support real connection. But if you're the only one adjusting, the only one reflecting, the only one putting in emotional effort while they stay the same, then it's no longer a relationship that's growing. It becomes waiting. And at some point, you have to ask yourself a hard question. Whose life are you actually living? Avoidant attachment can change. People can grow. But that change doesn't come from pressure, chasing, or silent self-sacrifice. It happens when the person chooses to face what they've been avoiding, when they decide to become aware instead of staying protected. When that shift does happen, many people describe a similar experience. It wasn't someone chasing them harder that made the difference. It was someone who didn't reinforce their fears. Their past had taught them that closeness meant pressure, that love meant losing themselves, that emotional intimacy would overwhelm them. Then they met someone different, not perfect, not distant, not playing games, but someone grounded. Someone with their own life. Someone who didn't panic when space appeared. Someone who didn't turn distance into urgency. Someone who simply kept living. In that kind of presence, something unfamiliar begins to happen. Slowly, not perfectly, and not without setbacks, their internal alarm starts to quiet down. For the first time, love doesn't feel like pressure. For the first time, connection doesn't feel like a threat to who they are. And that realization, even if it's inconsistent at first, begins to reshape how they see intimacy, not as danger, but as something that could actually be safe. But this only matters if both people are involved in the growth, not one person carrying everything while the other stays unchanged. So let's bring it back to something real and practical. If you care about someone with avoidant tendencies, there are a few truths you need to hold on to. Their distance is not a reflection of your worth. It doesn't mean you're too much, too emotional, too intense, or not enough in some hidden way. It's a learned response in their nervous system. You cannot love someone out of avoidance. You can't chase, adjust, or give more in order to make them feel safe. In fact, that often makes the cycle stronger. What actually creates change is stability, and that stability has to start within you. You also need to look at your own patterns honestly. If you keep feeling drawn to emotionally unavailable people, that's not random. It's familiar. It's what your system has learned to recognize as love. For a lot of people, inconsistency feels like chemistry. Distance feels like attraction. Unavailability feels deep. But those patterns can change only if you're willing to see them clearly. You also have to know your limit. There's one version of this where you grow, become more steady, create space, and the other person meets you halfway. And there's another version where you do all of that and nothing changes on their side. Both are real possibilities. Being honest about which one you're in is one of the most important forms of self-respect, and you are not responsible for fixing them. You can be patient, understanding, and emotionally aware, but you can't do someone else's inner work. You can't keep draining yourself just to hold on to someone who isn't actively choosing you. At the core of it, avoidant individuals aren't looking for distance. They're looking for freedom within connection. Not pressure, not chaos, not constant emotional pursuit, freedom. And when someone becomes truly grounded, not pretending to be independent but genuinely living from a full and steady place, they bring something rare into that dynamic. They're not chasing love, they're already living it. That shifts everything, because it challenges the belief that closeness has to come with losing yourself. If something here resonates with you, let that awareness stay with you, not as a way to fix someone else, but as a way to understand the pattern so clearly that you stop disappearing inside it. Someone else's distance does not define your value, and your urge to chase isn't proof of love. It's often just a learned response repeating itself. You can't force someone into emotional safety, and you can't shrink yourself into being chosen. Real change only happens when both people are willing to grow, take responsibility, and show up differently. So in the end, it's simple. Stop abandoning yourself just to keep someone else. Build your own emotional stability. Choose connections where effort goes both ways, and only stay where love allows you to be fully yourself, not where you have to disappear to be accepted. This was never about becoming less so someone else could stay. It was about realizing you were always enough as you are. Love is not meant to feel like a constant effort to prove your worth or earn someone's presence. The moment you stop chasing and start standing in your own stability, everything changes, not just how they see you, but how you see yourself. Because real connection doesn't ask you to disappear, it meets you fully where you stand. And the truth is, the right love will never require you to lose yourself just to keep it.